start time, and it looks like we are getting a good majority of us. So I'm going to go ahead and begin our housekeeping and introductions. So first of all, welcome everybody. My name is Eva. I am part of ELA staff, and I am here to MC your webinar experience today. So quick housekeeping items for ELA. Third Wednesday of each month, ELA monthly bulletin comes out. We have a beautiful new landing page available for all of you. If you come and subscribe quickly and easily to the bulletin, you can find that link in the chat. Just click on that and click on the buttons, prompts that are at that page, and you will be subscribed to our once monthly bulletin. It's got great opportunity for anybody looking for job postings, events coming up, and etc. On other upcoming events, we have our next Mid-Atlantic meetup at Green View Landscape on September 14th. And then it is not too late still to sign up for Seasons End Summit. It is a hybrid conference this year. The in-person portion held at New England Botanic Garden, as well as online on this October 26th. So next we're going to go ahead and introduce Asia Scudder. Asia Scudder's landscape designs are rooted in holistic principles of ecological systems. In 1998, she transitioned her career as a prairie ecologist with the Nature Conservancy, where she studied the sandhill prairies of Nebraska for landscaping, and she could see many shortcomings in the conventional landscape field. In response, she started her own company, Native Landscapes, beyond the scope of a typical landscape company. She describes her business as being proactive in education, public speaking, and community engagement, teaching and implementing strategies for native planting, soil reclamation, and fostering awareness about safeguarding the surrounding watershed are her passion. Pollinator gardens were a natural segue, introducing both commercial and residential clients to natural landscapes as an option. Present on designing your pollinator garden, here is Asia Scudder.
Well, hello everybody. I'm so glad that you're all here tonight. I have a feeling that a lot of you are already experts in this field, and there may be some of you that may be just novices. So I did try to create this presentation to hit a wide and broad audience. So I hope that you enjoy it, and definitely left time at the end for questions. And I'll go through the whole presentation and then just wait for questions to the end if that's okay with everyone. So let's jump right in. So I did become quite interested in pollinators as a segue from my landscape design company. And partly it was because of the clients that I had who were so excited. I have a anecdotal story of a client who was a high-end attorney, and he called me one day and said, you know, Asia, he said, whatever this flower is out here, I need more of them. I love the butterflies. I love that it's covered in butterflies. And that was my first inclination that pollinator gardens were a way to help people who might not otherwise have access to the natural world or understanding concepts of the natural world could bring that to their home gardens. So as part of this presentation, I was definitely doing a lot of research and finding nice points of interest for myself. I hope they're interesting to you as well. But one thing that I learned was that there are about 350,000 pollinator species in the world. And while bees and butterflies might be the most well-known, other insects, including flies, moths, beetles, ants, wasps, and many others, of course, bats and birds and others, also pollinate. And many have evolved symbiotic relationships with specific host plants. Worldwide, there are an estimated 20,000 species of bees, and approximately 3,600 species are native to the United States and Canada. So as we go into talking today about how to design for pollinators, of course, we're not going to try to reach every pollinator. So there's choices. You get to make some choices. One thing that I love right now is that pollinator gardens are gaining in popularity. And this was a photo that was taken up in Portland, Maine, where many of the front yards are becoming more loose, I would say, less of the traditional trimmed lawn landscape and more welcoming to pollinators. So definitely as awareness grows throughout the country and really around the world, more households and businesses are doing what they can to provide garden feeding stations for pollinators. So this is the series of photos that were taken in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And again, just even I'm witnessing, I'm sure you all are as well, or maybe some of you are even working on commercial projects where pollinator plantings are becoming more common. I really enjoyed watching pollinators feeding on these different flowers. But I do want to step back and take a broader view, especially with my work with the Nature Conservancy, who does such an incredible job of preserving large acreages or tracts of land. This question of nature, bringing nature back to our awareness on a daily basis, but nature is pretty big. And so the term nature might refer to living plants and animals, geological processes, and weather that evolved symbiotically over time while sharing resources in what we call a natural environment or a wilderness. Nature is a complex system involving interactions of flora and fauna over time in areas that may not have been substantially altered by humans, or maybe that persist despite human intervention.
Exactly how the White House takes messages from here. Especially from our reporting with senior.
Is everyone able to hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. So prairies evolved over tens of thousands of years. And prairies historically covered nearly 1/3 of North America, a sea of grass that stretched from the Rocky Mountains to east to the Mississippi River, and from Saskatchewan, Canada, south to Texas. It was the continent's largest continuous ecosystem, supporting an enormous quantity of plants and animals. Prairies developed into one of the most complicated and diverse ecosystems in the world, surpassed only by the rainforest of Brazil. Also, historically, through fire and grazing, the prairie was maintained over thousands of years, and that would be grazing by bison mainly. Since then, agriculture, suppression of natural fires, and urbanization have reduced the footprint of our prairie ecosystems. In New England, we are host to multiple ecoregions, and I really love this map, and I wish that I had more time to delve more deeply into it for this presentation, but I did leave a link there for you if you're curious. And across the New England area, there are approximately over 3,500 species of plants. Some of those plants are dependent on pollinators for their success, and likewise, pollinators depend on certain species of plants for their survival. And of course, some of these ecoregions are more open, have open grasslands, and are available to pollinators. But the purpose of this presentation is pollinator gardens. So why? Why pollinator gardens? So in New England, specifically in Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Vermont, these areas were largely cleared in colonial times that left open areas for growth of warm and cool season plants. And that was conducive to pollinator populations. And as trees slowly grew back in the 1870s, there was canopy closure, further urbanization, and really intensive agriculture that has led to reduced habitat for pollinators. So our threats in this area to pollinators include habitat loss, pests and pathogens, pesticides, and climate change, which I won't really touch on today, but that's a big discussion. In the 4-state region, there are over 400 species of just bees, and really not that much is known about them. What their foraging habits are, what their nesting habits are. So there's still so much to learn about pollinators, and we feel like we're a bit in a race to save some of those populations. But I want to talk for a moment about the iconic monarch butterfly. This is a migratory species, as you know, and it makes its way from Mexico to Canada, traveling over 2,500 miles, breeding and feeding on this long, arduous route. But due to extensive agriculture, insecticides, and low availability of their host plant, the milkweed, the monarch population has dropped 80% according to recent numbers. So there currently is a call to put the monarch butterfly on the endangered species list in the United States. The hopeful news about that, if that were to happen, is that states would then be required to plant suitable and connected plantings along the monarch's migratory path. And I use that word connected plantings intentionally because if you can go back to the scope of the prairie, these open areas where there's multiple plants available for insects to forage on, we really have dissected those pathways for these foragers, pollinators throughout the country. Also, over recent years, wild bee populations have rapidly declined, which is very alarming. So the rusty-patched bumblebee, the numbers have declined by 87%, the American bumblebee by 90%, and the Western bumblebee by 93%. So there are some people who feel like the neonicotinoids, a widely used agricultural insecticide, are toxic to bees, and they do kill indiscriminately, exterminating not only pest insects, but also countless butterflies, bees, and other wildlife. In fact, since their introduction, neonics have made U.S. agriculture nearly 50 times more harmful to insect life. So it's a very serious thing. Also, mosquito control companies use the insecticide known as pyrethrins, which are derived from chrysanthemum flowers, but also toxic to insects. So whether natural or synthetic, these are broad spectrum insecticides that are highly toxic to a wide variety of insects, not just mosquitoes. So there is attempts by some individuals and companies to use IPM or integrated pest management. Another topic that's a really big topic to talk about, that we're just going to touch on that tonight. So I think we understand why a pollinator garden, the need for a continuous source of food and habitat for these pollinators is essential. So what goes into a pollinator garden? And first of all, let's talk about inspiration, because gardening is truly satisfying, and adding elements that help to support pollinators is an added joy that you can bring to any garden. I think we all agree on that. So some of the things that are needed for a pollinator garden: water, biodiversity, habitat, sunlight, soil. And I say soil here also because there are some nesting bees that use soil and other insects as their, where they lay eggs, where there's larval growth, and those insects come up through the soil. And so having a nice, healthy, loamy soil is helpful also. One thing I became curious about is actually how many flowers would a person need to plant in a garden in order for pollinators to survive? So some of that information's really hard to find, but it's known that honeybees visit between 50 and 100 flowers during one collection flight from the hive. So in order to produce 1 pound of honey, 2 million flowers have to be visited. Also, I found out that a hive of bees may fly up to 55,000 miles cumulatively to produce 1 pound of honey. And then in the bumblebee world, on a favorable day, a bumblebee would visit 6,000 flowers, and on an average 4 to 5 hour day, 2,500 to 3,000 flowers. So I did find one study out of Illinois where researchers assessed nectar production in urban gardens by measuring the floral resources. This was in 2019 in 59 gardens. These gardens were dominated by non-native species. So I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So there was 77% of all the plants in the study were non-native, but they accounted for 90% of total nectar production. So we all know, right, that non-native plants are a problem. They certainly don't provide the other benefits that native plants do, such as supporting the life cycle of pollinators or creating nesting habitat, but they can be quite productive sources of food. So big argument on that, but certainly the single most productive garden in this study produced almost 700 times more nectar than the least productive, illustrating the wide difference of plants across all gardens. So I have a link to that study. It was there also, which you can write down. So of course, nectar is the very most important sustaining food source for pollinators. And we all know it's that sugary liquid that flowers produce to lure in insects. So I'm just going to flash through a couple of slides here. This is common milkweed, Queen Anne's lace with ants who are feeding, echinacea, goldenrod, yarrow. This is just a garden installation. It's the aster. This is from a seed packet. They had quite a lot of success. But let's take a minute and talk about native versus non-native plants. So if I were in the room with you, I'd have you raise your hands and have a show of hands of those of you who are objectively opposed to non-native plants. So, but I'll just have to imagine that there's a certain percentage of you who do feel that way. I myself have a background in ecology. I worked specifically in the Sandhills Prairie in northern Nebraska, which the really only invasive plant there was the bromus grass from grazing that had infiltrated parts of the prairie. But certainly have had lots of experience as a landscaper with non-native plants. So we all know that native plants are adapted to our local growing season, climate, and soil. They generally require less water and maintenance, and they are more likely to provide pollinators with sufficient nectar and pollen. Non-native plants, on the other hand, may not produce enough nectar or habitat to sustain those insects. So going back to the idea of non-natives providing a food source, dandelions are a non-native species. They were believed to have been brought over to North America on the Mayflower for medicinal use, but they are a main source of food in early spring when both bees and dandelions start to emerge after a long winter. And here we kind of get into a speculative conversation, I think, about whether the disturbance that we have created for what would have been a natural environment for pollinators can be supported by non-native plants. So also clover, of the world's 300 clover species, none are native to northeastern United States, although there are 19 species in the Northeast, including white clover and red clover. And white clover does turn out to be a favorite food for pollinators. So good or bad, we'll talk about it when we get to our question and answer period. So some native cultivars may be comparable substitutions for native species in pollinator habitat restoration projects, but each cultivar should be evaluated on an individual basis. And this is a study that was done from the University of Maine. In a Vermont study of purple coneflower and 3 of its cultivars, double flowered and hybridized cultivars were significantly less attractive to pollinators than the species. Similarly, for enhancing bee habitat, gardeners can grow milkweed, poppy, sages, mints, oregano, and numerous others, for example, over choices such as daffodils, tulips, daylilies, and heathers, which receive few visits from bees. So there's, I don't know, there's something to be said maybe for choosing certain plants. There is a line here when we start talking about invasive plants. So studies do suggest that as invasive plants spread, pollinator forage opportunities on native plants are lost, as are fruit and seed production in the native plant species. Evolutionary relationships between pollinators and their host plants might be disrupted. So here's a list of the invasive plants in New England, and they do displace native plants, and in many cases do not provide those sustaining habitat needs that pollinators depend on for their longevity and livelihood. So, okay, so we've covered a lot of ground already. We've talked about prairie ecosystems. We've talked about agriculture and urbanization, the problem with pesticides or insecticides. And somehow we're supposed to sit down and think about how to design for pollinators. So how do you actually start? Where do you start? And I'm a person that likes to start locally in my own backyard. That's the best. For me, that's the best. And also in my experience as a landscape designer, often if I was working with a client who had decided to make their yard more pollinator friendly, I found that neighbors became curious and interested, and sort of a word of mouth, people began to get excited about that and wanted to know how they could also participate and add pollinator plants into their own gardens. So the first thing I would always do when I met with a client is to talk with them about how much of their property they wanted to devote to pollinators. So some people, I'm here in New Hampshire, there's a lot of space, a lot of edge, I'll say like wildness on the edges of properties. But in places such as Massachusetts or down like in Brookline, maybe a little tighter quarters to try to sort out how to start a pollinator garden. So you can decide how you want to designate different parts of your yard for border plantings, walkways, lawn areas, and let those proportions be up to your discretion. And the question really comes down to, how do you want to utilize your outdoor space? So maybe you want to have an open lawn surrounded by greenery for privacy. Maybe you enjoy having an outdoor kitchen or a patio and cooking outdoors. Some people enjoy having a private, quiet sitting area for reading or reflection, cutting gardens, food production, fruit trees with vegetables or herb gardens. And maybe you have kids who want to be able to throw a football or have a swimming pool. All of these things are possible while also building pollinator gardens around those core ideas. So before you begin to choose your plants, then you want to also look at your site and determine how much sunlight is available. As you know, most perennials need about 6 hours of sunlight a day to really do well. What are your soil and drainage properties on your property? The slope and aspect, existing plant communities that might be nearby. If there are existing plants in your garden, then what are the bloom times? Maybe you want to fill a gap in the flowering season. And then also not only considering the herbaceous or the shrub layer, but also thinking about trees as well. So there are several apps to use for garden design these days. Many of these apps have a monthly fee, like we're sort of used to, you know, $1.99 or $4.99 a month, where you can take a photo of your home and find a list of plant species that you would like to add and get to work on designing. It's sort of a fun way to design. I love that there are multiple apps that are available that provide that service. So this is a little bit of a messy slide of how I would construct a pollinator garden. And if I had a property that was sort of a traditional rectangle, I would create a soft curved area at the corners or the shoulders of my property. And that would allow me to plant trees towards the back with groupings of shrubs and trees that kind of descend in size towards the front of the bed, leaving an opening in the front for your perennials. Also makes it a lot easier to maintain those flowers in the front. So you'll see here that I have red twig dogwood in the design, low growth sumac, 9-bark, cinquefoil. I also sometimes will just throw in like a traditional, like a dwarf Alberta spruce or an azalea. Part of that came from my working with builders and in subdivisions who are looking for a little bit cleaner style. Although they wanted native plants, they didn't particularly want to have that really messy meadow look. So I had to sort of developed a style of putting in some foundation plants that were evergreens. So another thing I would like to pitch out there is that when you're planning your design, you want to consider what skills or knowledge you have. So the reason I find that to be important is it's easy to get overwhelmed by a garden. I've done that myself, where I've gotten excited about getting started, put a ton of plants in, gotten busy, went on vacation, had, you know, I don't know, all sorts of interruptions, and came back to a garden that was completely overgrown and kind of, you know, frustrating in a way. Not the garden that I wanted to show off and be proud of. So I don't think it's a bad idea to just right up front think about how much time you want to spend in the garden or how much time you have available. And then let your design reflect your ability to maintain all of that hard work and investment you've put into implementing your plan. So yeah, just again, given the right conditions, it's super easy for a pollinator garden to take root and just take off. And this is a property up in Stratham, New Hampshire that had milkweed, and then over in Exeter, New Hampshire, a place that actually is so advanced that sumac has started to grow and take root right downtown. It's kind of nice, but it's a little crazy. So when you think about your maintenance availability, also what's your skill level? So any time I've worked with a client, they always seem a little bit frustrated with how much time is needed for just even light trimming or weeding. So just expect that. Like, unless you have a yard that you just want to let go and let, you know, survival of the fittest take over. Every garden is basically going to take some effort and some time. Also, before you get really involved in an intricate design, think about what your annual gardening budget is. So I just took this example of this planted out garden, which I estimate probably just with the plant cost at about $400. And for some people, that's not even a problem. They don't mind doing that. But it's certainly easy to make impulse purchases, especially in the spring when the greenhouses are like displaying these amazing plants. And again, I've done that myself, just grab too many plants. And then it's like, oh no. So good to have also seed sharing resources and plant sharing resources. So if you do plan a garden, when you prepare that landscape design, that really does help you make the best choices for your garden, saving you money and bringing you success over time for your pollinator garden. So which flowers should you choose? When I started my landscape company, I worked for a landscape architect who had a tendency to plant plants that were high maintenance plants. And that, I would say, although they were native, they were frustrating to the customer who wanted to have a simpler garden. And so some of the plants that I'm going to show you today are just really easily accessible plants. And I assume all of you really either know or have resources available to go out and make those plant choices. So I don't think that any of these plants are going to be surprises per se. I did try to do just a little background research on the pollinators that might be tied or connected to different plants. So again, when selecting plants, it is important to choose native species that are adapted to your local climate and soil conditions when possible. And also just remembering to plant a variety of flowers that bloom at different times throughout the growing season so that you are ensuring a continuous food source for pollinators. And of course, perennials. When you plant a perennial in full sun, plant them in well-drained soil, and you can space the plants about 18 inches apart. Your plants will perform best when grown in full sun, but some do tolerate light shade. And they may not flower as profusely, but they will prosper and do well. So also, most perennials tolerate poor soils, and some types of perennials will flop over if grown in too rich or too wet of a soil. They also start to get mildew and different types of fungus on the leaves. So it's good to remember that these perennials are tough plants, and they have deep roots, and they were meant for dry conditions and xeric conditions. However, you do want to water them regularly during that first growing season to make sure that they do establish that strong root system. So that, yeah, once established, your garden will be fairly drought tolerant, and make sure that you have good drainage and aeration to enable the plant to survive wet winters. And yeah, so just to go through a very short handful of plants that are just the go-to standards, really. Wild indigo is a tall, sturdy perennial that has spikes of blue, purple, or white flowers. And this plant specifically serves the needs of Peckham's minor bee and the cranberry leafcutter bee. So this is actually a very important plant. It can, as you know, it can get quite large, but you can just trim back after it flowers, trim back quite regularly if needed. Just going to talk about the purple coneflower because it is a species that has been somewhat adulterated in the greenhouse industry. So there's been many, many iterations of echinacea. And the native echinacea, here, let me show you here, is a much different looking flower. It has very narrow petals with most of the resources of the plant going towards that nectar and pollen creation. So of course, we as homeowners, we love to have big flourishing gardens with beautiful color. And it's not that that's necessarily a bad thing, but some of those cultivars, as we were seeing in that research paper from earlier, do not provide the same level of nourishment as the native echinacea. But again, a much different looking plant. Beautiful nonetheless. Bee balm, incredibly helpful for lots of different bees, butterflies, and even hummingbirds. And again, this is the native or a native bee balm. This is called the spotted bee balm. And again, just much, much different. And we all know goldenrod. And you might be aware that ragweed blooms at the same time as goldenrod. So often goldenrod gets blamed for allergies, but actually it's not. It's ragweed. So anyway, I thought this was interesting that the goldenrod gallfly has a larva that feeds inside a round gall on the stem. And the larvae are dependent on goldenrod. And then also, just as an extension of that, and is some of that complexity of how nature is just so interdependent, that there's the downy woodpecker and the chickadees that feed on the larvae and the galls, that often we might see the goldenrod as just a weed because it is so prolific, but it actually is a very important food source and part of the life cycle of this goldenrod gallfly. And then the milkweed, of course, which we all know is the monarch's dependence on that. The New England aster is a larval host plant for crescent butterfly and the Canadian soma moth and the mining bee. Very, very important source of nutrition for pollinators of all types in the fall. And then, of course, the black-eyed Susan, which characteristically does take over gardens, but is also an important feeder plant for many pollinators. There are several low-growing plants, violets, the wild strawberry, even creeping Charlie, which we know is a weed, but sometimes these plants can be used in replacement of mulch to help just block out weeds and store moisture in the soil. And then common thyme. If you don't want to have or don't have room for a garden in your yard, you can always plant in containers. The cement containers on the right side of that picture are pretty massive and pretty, I don't know how attractive they are, but they're definitely native plants. And anyway, but they can definitely add variety to garden areas. And some plants that have like mint, or some plants that are escape artists, sometimes I'll plant those in pots. And we're just sort of rounding toward the end here of this presentation. That research has shown that woody plants may account for almost 2/3 of total nectar production. And so not only flowers or shrubs, but also there appears to be high nectar production in woody plants. attributed to more efficient use of space because trees and shrubs have the advantage of height over shorter herbaceous flowering plants. So this may build a case for the inclusion of more insect pollinated trees and shrubs in pollinator gardens to make use of vertical space, especially when garden areas are limited. So canopy trees such as red maple, black tupelo, black cherry, American basswood are visited by bees when in flower. The American chestnut was a dominant tree in parts of New England and may have provided substantial pollen for bees. So quickly, just going through, talking about shade and sun. So apparently when the understory light conditions increase, then the pollinator community is also likely to increase in abundance and diversity. Romy et al. In 2007 found an increase in bee abundance associated with goldenrod and brambles after logging in a hardwood forest in New York. So in closed canopies, bees are presumably present, though at low density, and could be necessary for pollination of some understory plants. Buford in 1987 found that a shade-adapted understory herb, enchanter's nightshade, is pollinated specifically by syrphid flies. So we're thinking about habitat also. So we've got foraging in pollinator species in flowers, shrubs, and trees. And then there's also a need for habitat for nesting bees. So the pithy stems in staghorn sumac, elderberry, and blackberry are sometimes used as nests, as well as stone cavities, clay, soils, and fine sand. There also are opportunities that that now there's sort of these nesting houses that you can purchase and watering fountains so you can have water in your garden for your pollinators. Also, a question about when to mow. So the best practice is to mow after the first frost in the fall or before the plant growth begins in late winter or early spring. And so you should rotate and only mow half of whatever pollinator habitat you have on a rotational schedule, because some species of insects lay eggs on plant materials that overwinter. Just a quick suggestions for great shrubs for pollinators, birds, and other wildlife. So not just pollinators, but also birds who enjoy the berries of elderberry or high bush blueberry, yellow twig dogwood, witch hazel, viburnum, St. John's wort. And just the key takeaways from this are the importance of diversity in planting, having habitat available for your pollinators, obviously a food source in some abundance. So maybe not just one or two plants, but seeing if you can plant a series of different plants and even maybe connect with neighbors and have a neighborhood agreement that you'll all plant a certain plant to support a certain variety of pollinator, having a water source available, and if at all possible, please be insecticide free. There are so many organic options for pest control, and there's also just letting things run their course too. And so I definitely have a lot of expertise and experience in successful gardens that have been completely free of chemicals and no insecticides, no herbicides, and looking absolutely beautiful and lush. So I want to make sure there's time for questions, so I'm going to just stop right there and open the floor for questions.
Wolf, go ahead and come off of mute and feel free to ask your question.
Hi. So, yeah, I've already panicked on listserv about this, but what about the impact of jumping worms, the invasive jumping worms that seem to be, well, I discovered them tragically in my garden, and I can see now already there's like erosion around my native shrubs, and I know nobody really knows what to do, but like these worms, they love mulch, but do I put more soil on these poor shrubs, or what do I do?
Yeah, so there is, I don't know if you're on, are you on Facebook by any chance? There is a group on Facebook that is trying to share success stories. It is unfortunate that it has become such a huge problem. If those of you who don't know, these worms that are depleting, they come through, and instead of enhancing the soil, they absolutely do the opposite, and they deplete the soil and create a very hard pack, almost clay-like compact soil. So this unfortunate thing I've heard is that people have had to just go through and hand pick them and put them into like a cup of gasoline or something.
Yeah, no, well, no, it's you can put them in water and soap, or vinegar, alcohol, and I've been doing that. But there's, the sad part is they're going to die at the first frost, the adults, but by then they've laid their eggs, which are like indestructible. And then you read about, oh, well, solarizer. So, well, how is a small gardener supposed to put plastic like everything without killing the plants and caterpillars that are nesting? Also, I can't do that. I was just wondering, I don't know, I'm also using the tea seed meal, but still, I guess there just has to be, I guess, some level of acceptance that we're destroying our environment, and this is part of it. But to me, this is almost worse than invasive plant species because it's the soil.
Yeah, I agree.
I think, it looks like the deep-rooted plants, the prairie type plants that I have, should be okay, but I don't know for sure, because what I've heard is we don't know yet. Like in 2 years, maybe they won't be.
I know. And I know people who are planting in raised planters and while they sort it out, but I know you're right that there doesn't seem to be a perfect solution yet. So sorry
Yeah, they
about
get into
that.
planters. Oh, like they can climb. They climb trees, apparently. So yeah, they're really awful.
Yeah, sorry. I don't have an answer. I wish I
Okay.
did. Yeah.
Thank you.
I have a question. I don't know if my hand is raised. Can you hear me all right? Great.
Yeah.
You had mentioned as a tip to try and evaluate a client's position on maintenance, that they get frustrated easily with maintenance. So if you're working with a new client, how do you adequately assess that? I mean, I think most people are going to say, of course, I'll be out here working in the yard. Of course, I'll maintain it. But any tips on how to really assess the actual level of maintenance they're willing to employ in the garden?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I know maybe other people have had this experience where some clients have been watching like HGTV or seen an amazing garden in a magazine, and they just so much are committed to wanting that garden that may be a really high maintenance garden. And it can be hard to talk them out of it, if they're not. I guess the other question is, do they have the budget to hire somebody to just do all the maintenance? But I guess I tend to be, at this point in my life, I tend to be more conservative with clients. So I won't put something in their yard that is really aggressive as a grower, like trumpet vine or wisteria, unless they're specifically asking for that plant. And I just make crystal clear that it's going to be a every few weeks, there's going to be maintenance involved with this plant. I think that's the best response I can give, is just trying to be as clear as I can with what certain plants like have red flags attached to them. They might look really beautiful, but this is going to be a little bit of work. And are you sure, are you sure this is what you want?
Right. I mean, I try to steer towards shrubs and trees, explain their pollination benefits, but those require, to some degree, some maintenance. And so just trying to assess, are they really going to take care of things, I think is a challenge. So.
Absolutely. I know. And yeah, that whole idea that, I mean, this sounds silly in a way, but sometimes I feel like I have to tell a client, this isn't furniture that you've bought and put into your house, that these are growing living things that take up room and space and need water and nutrients. So yeah, I never want to ever insult anybody, but sometimes I feel like there's just a lack of experience or hands-on experience with gardens.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation.
Hi, this is Debbie. I did have my hand raised. I just wanted to jump in. I wasn't sure if it was being called that way. And my question is there a minimum square footage of native garden for it to be effective? Sort of along the lines of when you do a compost pile, it's supposed to be a minimum of 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet. And so, yeah, just wondering, like, planting one thing or something, just as a worst case scenario, right? If someone just starting like, oh, I'm just going to plant this, is it effective, or does there need to be sort of a minimum square footage?
One thing I loved about the research I was doing today, especially around that question, it looked as if people even had a small garden area that they planted in layers, so that there were that level of ground cover with some flowering perennials and then some flowering shrubs, and then maybe even a small tree or an espalier, that just those layers of opportunities for pollinators to feed could happen even more efficiently in a small garden than a large garden that doesn't have as many opportunities.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, next we've got Ann Dorfman. I see your hand raised.
Hi, yeah. Hi, thanks. A couple questions. One is, I'm curious what you have found as good, sort of easy to manage and very valuable native plants versus difficult to manage and, less something that you have less of a benefit. You had sort of mentioned earlier that you had some that you would mention. So I'm curious about that. And I'm also curious about, you also talked about some, say that's Lila back there.
I'm a granddaughter.
So, and I'm also curious, you talked about some online garden design apps, and I wonder if there's some that have a better selection of native plants that you would recommend using.
That's a good question. Let's see. So first, to start, like, some of the native plants that I really like are like the Liatris, the spicata, that is so easy to grow. And because it spreads by underground rhizomes, but it's sort of slow, like first year, obviously there's none. Second year, maybe one or two. But third year, you can have a nice grouping. Also, I forgot to mention that there's some native grasses that are really important to pollinators for their life cycle needs. And little blue stem is one, which I love anyway in the garden, and big blue stem also.
Can I turn it into
Um,
like cut out the box and turn it into
The
an
way
portrait?
Hollywood writers and actors strike concerns they have about their images and their.
I also love that the shrubby cinquefoil is super
Hmm.
easy. St. John's wort I love. And I'm, as far as shrubs, like the nine bark is, I enjoy the purplish color of the leaves, but then of course it has berries, that are good for birds and feed the birds. Trying to think of, some of those like go-tos, like the echinacea are really nice performers in the garden, but and maybe people get bored with those or something. I don't know. Or the black-eyed Susans planted with a native tall garden phlox. There's there's also a native phlox that's a ground cover that's absolutely beautiful, and it grows in part shade to full shade. I also like the native violets for that ground cover. There's such a big list. I think that's why I kind of shied away from that. And in terms of the apps, I would have to go back and just kind of review the apps that I've tried out. And I wonder if there's a place like for a follow-up that I could put some information in.
I'll hop in
some
here,
kind
Asia. Sorry, you can feel
Mhm.
free to email ELA and we can disseminate any follow-up information to the audience as well as anybody who has to go directly at 7 and can't stay for a later Q&A.
Okay.
7 Eastern, you can feel free to
Mhm.
email ELA staff or board members and we will disseminate any questions or information sent out.
Okay, perfect. Okay, well, I'll do that. So I'll send the information about the app and that
Great,
way.
that'd be wonderful. Thank you.
Mhm.
Looks like next we have Jay Fadis.
Close enough, Fettis. My question has to do with planting pollinators from seed. I don't know if that's something that you had much experience in, or if you tended to plant full plants or plugs. But I've started to, just as of last winter and the spring, started seeding both some pollinator small meadow areas for myself as well as a couple other people, and have had varied success. Actually, I had the least success on my own property, where I have quite a bit of sun. I actually have trouble growing things like carrots or lettuce because they're usually either seated on the surface or close to the surface, and the soil dries out quickly. So when I planted the pollinator seeds, I did spread around some straw, as one might if they were planting lawn, which I thought would help, but I still didn't really get much germination. In fact, I got a lot of germination just of other things that grow on my property.
I see. Sometimes there was one experience I had when I worked at a nature center, and we converted 220 acres back to prairie. And so we did go through and clear all the invasives and what we did was we planted a cover crop. So we planted crimson clover and then let the cover crop sort of shade out any seeds from weeds that have sort of remained in the soil. And then went ahead and sowed the seeds. I think it was after the first frost. So the crimson clover had died back, and then we seeded, and then in the spring, those seeds came back. And that seemed to be successful because we had the nice cover crop of the sort of the dead, the biomass from the crimson clover to protect the seeds, if that makes sense. You can also do that with an annual like annual, like buckwheat, you can plant interseed. It kind of, I don't know why. I think it helps to stabilize the soil and the water, it holds the water in place while the seeds are getting established, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I might give that a try.
Yeah, maybe try in like a one section or something and see how it goes.
Yeah, I've got plenty of space to experiment, so I'll do that. I'll set aside an area and give that a try. So thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. And then last person I see with their hand raised in the queue is James Johnson. After James' question, we'll fire off a few of those from the chat, and then we will wrap up.
Hey, can you hear me?
Uh-huh, I can, yeah.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for your input with all these wonderful things about pollinating gardens. I run a small botanical garden in New York. We're not at minus 10 or 20, but we're a little bit luckier than you with the temperature problem. But I'm trying to do seed too, like that other question. And have you used seed in the fall, or would you like we're coming into the fall, and I'm starting some prairie areas, and I'm going crazy with seed. I just want to throw seed down. Anytime I see soil, I'm like, we have a big problem with mugwort. I don't know if you have that up there.
Mm.
Yeah, we really have it's really bad. So when would you recommend I throw seed down for in the fall? Like,
Yeah, so let's see. I'm trying to remember when we did that installation of seeds. It was in the fall after the first frost. And how large of an area are you trying to cover?
let's say 200 feet by 50 feet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because the seeds, as you know, they
Pardon?
have to harden off. So you can either, you have the option of putting them in the freezer over the winter and bringing them out in the spring around the time of the last frost, or you can go ahead and follow nature's rules, right? And just go ahead and spread that. Let the snow fall on them, let them settle into the soil. And then, I mean, we did have success doing that in the fall after, like I said, after the first frost. So yeah, it should. How many varieties of plants are you trying to seed?
I'm using just a potpourri of everything. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
I just got some standard perennial things, and and that seems to be working. But I think that I'll put it down in the fall. The other problem is, it's great bird seed.
I know. Yeah, it's true.
So that makes you. So I think I'll throw down. And also, thanks a lot for really kind of talking about, doing these gardens and not, and throwing in some in exotics or whatever, so non-natives, especially I'm in Brooklyn, New York. So I really need to ease this, native plant thing into the, into these people's psyche. We can't just jam it down their throat.
Mhm. Exactly. Yeah.
So I appreciate you talking about that. I think that that's really important to mix the two, and we can increase the the natives. But thanks, that was great to hear that. I thought it was. I'm on the same wavelength to to just throw some things in.
Yeah, great. Yeah, exactly. Yes.
Okay.
I think it helps. Yeah.
Oh, right. And then we've got a couple more questions from the chat. This one is from Tom and Jen Mann. says earlier in the presentation you mentioned pollinator specific plants, and I'm wondering, do these pollinators have more than one plant they are dependent upon, since they may need several food sources throughout the growing season? Thank you.
So the research I've done suggested that about 15% of all pollinators in New England are specifically tied to one plant for not only its life cycle, but also for sustenance or food. So that leaves, 85% that are not and can sort of be omnivores, I guess, and go to different plants for food source. So of course the monarch is an example of a butterfly that can feed on different plants, but its larva needs to feed on the milkweed. So specifically the monarch lays eggs on milkweed plants, but can feed on zinnias or marigolds or any flower. So I just have to, unfortunately, this is such a complex topic that I wished I could go into more and more detail on it. So what I would suggest is, I noticed that New Hampshire at UNH has a really awesome site for pollinators in New England. And I saw that they do have very specific information about certain pollinators and the plants that they are tied to. But yeah, it is a very complex topic, no doubt. I mean, when you think of how little we know about nature and the natural processes that occur around us all day, every day, it's like, and we, of course, we think that we might be immune from all of that. And I think this is so good at what ELA does in promoting and talking about how we can do better in trying to understand what those natural processes are. And as an ecologist, I just remember even in college just being amazed at how some people had a very telescopic view on one certain process, one certain biological process, and that was their 30-year career, was just studying that cycle. And it just is very amazing and sort of awe-inspiring in some ways. How many people are out there learning about and writing about and researching all of these topics. And then we as homeowners or property owners get to have access to that information and kind of do the best we can to support those certain pollinators that, are in our areas naturally, and those native plants that, are maybe on the verge of being endangered, and we can certainly become hosts for those species of plants and animals. But yeah, I would encourage you to go to that UNH website. They had really quite like an encyclopedia of information about that.
Great. Our next question is curious about the native suckering roses in the Carolinas/Virginia. Do you have suggestions for maintaining them so they don't take over a space? I care for 2 gardens that already had them installed, and these seem to be a bit of a nightmare to keep contained.
They are. They love to, as you said, they just love to send out those suckers. And my experience with plants like that is it is just part of gardening maintenance. And sometimes certain plants, like I was mentioning the trumpet vine before, I have a client right now who has a trumpet vine that just is everywhere. It's growing under the deck, and I'm sure you guys have seen or experienced that. And he gets so frustrated, but I kind of just accept it as just part of the kind of like it is what it is. I just have to deal with it. But you could try, I don't know. I mean, it depends on what the garden site is like. And sometimes I will use just heavy cardboard over an area where there might be sprouts coming up and see if I can convince them to grow somewhere else. But ultimately, they tend to travel underneath cardboard. So I would say it's just a matter of a hands-on, just do it, grin and bear it.
Great answer. Our next question from Patricia Shepard actually looks like our last question is going to be, what suggestion for educating public on black swallowwort?
So I guess I'm naive about black swallowwort. So maybe can someone give me a clue about that?
I can. It's it's in the milkweed family, and it tends to vine and it makes pods, and so monarch is are attracted to it. But if it lays its larva there, the larva will not survive.
Oh, yes, I see. I understand.
Okay.
Yep.
Mhm.
Okay. Now I got that. Yep. So educating. Yeah. I mean, I don't know what everybody thinks, but I am not opposed to going to nurseries and talking to them about certain plants that are problematic. I will go to Lowe's or Home Depot and talk to managers and express my concerns. And also, surprisingly, I know we're all can be tired of social media, but social media is super effective at getting the word out about different problems and solutions to problems. So I'm also a proponent of making a meme and or something, making a picture and saying this is why this is a problem and asking people to share it with their friends. And I mean, that's how I've learned about the jumping worm problem and other people on social media sharing those things. So, but I do think it is important to share and talk about that. Absolutely. So.
All right. And with that, we are a little bit over our time. Thank you to everybody who stayed with us. Asia, thank you so much for your time and your indicators. Thank you to all of our audience and participants today who gave us such an in-depth conversation Q&A. Please make sure, those of you who still remain, that you do fill out the SurveyMonkey link, which is in the chat. Those evaluations help us to improve all of our webinars going forward and all of your webinar experiences. But again, thank you all so much for joining us. Please feel free to reach out to any staff members if you have any questions left over that you'd like us to communicate. And have a great rest of your week.